York is home to one of England's finest buildings, the Minster. But hidden around the city, you can find the sad remains of once great monastic houses that covered the local skyline here, before Henry VIII's brutal dissolution of the monasteries, like this unassuming riverside wall, which was actually once the southern wall of a palatial friary. I'm going to show these remains across the whole city, some hidden, some more spectacular, but all very different. And I'll also show you the exact site where the king stood whilst York locals begged for his forgiveness. And we can compare all of these sites to an illustration from 1915 of what each monastery may have looked like. The original copy is in York Mansion House and they very kindly let me use it. Which brings us to the wall. You can actually see the exact wall that stands there today on this sketch, and behind it the incredible Franciscan friary, home to the York members of the Franciscan order. It was built in the 1230s with timber granted from Henry III, and over time it grew into a building described as nothing short of palatial. Even though the royal castle was situated just next door, King Edward III chose to stay at this friary in 1327 with his mother and an entourage of over 600, so that gives some clues as to the scale of the site. On the 27th of November 1538, the house was signed over to Henry VIII's commissioners. All that survives are small pieces of wall and the name on the street, Friargate. Just imagine if this friary still stood here today. This is the area that the whole site covered, and a look at what it looks like to this day. Another very similar example can be seen down Black Horse Passage, a rather unpleasant back alley. Most of the wall is clearly modern brick, but part of the bottom is actually older stone masonry, because this was part of the western wall of another friary, this one housing the Carmelite order. It was built in 1295 and covered this area of York on screen. In 1314, Edward II granted permission for a quay to be built on the River Foss here, so building materials could be shipped in to build the friary. It was surrendered in 1538, and by 1958, 400 years later, the site was entirely built over as it remains today. And again, all that remains is this wall and a street name, Carmelite Street. So a bit of a running theme going on here, which brings us over the river to Priory Street, where we find our first monastery of the video, and it's also the only monastery to survive as a place of worship. It's also the location of the photo board that I'm using for this video, so if you're in York, make sure to pop in and give a little donation if you can. You see, Holy Trinity Church looks like a beautiful yet ordinary parish church. So what happened to the great monastery here, also known as Holy Trinity Priory? This is the church now from above, and this is the monastic precinct, a huge difference. Well, it was actually known as an alien monastery because in 1089 the estate was handed to a Norman lord who invited Benedictine monks over from Marmoutier Abbey in France, and that remained the parent house to Holy Trinity until 1466. In 1538 the monastery was dissolved after 6 monks were accused of sodomy, a new criminal offence used to help Henry destroy the monasteries. It wasn't until 1850 that the old monastery precinct was sold off, as building lots and Priory Street was then built. The old gateway was actually here at the entrance to Priory Street, and you can see the Priory pub with the arches as the logo. But what survived of the monastery? Well, firstly we have this quaint house named Jacob's Well, built around 1474 as a lodging for one of the Priory's priests. But going to the actual church building, part of the current nave is actually part of the original priory nave. And we can see what the monastery looked like with this great screen, with thanks to the team at Christianity and Culture. So how did the nave survive? It's a rather interesting story. Well, this priory also partly classed as a parish church. I believe there are about 250 monasteries up and down the country with this case. The nave served the local community as well as the inhabitants of the monastery. The local parishioners held established rites to worship in the monastery, and these rites were respected after dissolution. The nave and central tower were kept for the parish, but unfortunately the tower was destroyed in a storm a few years later. This was of course not the entire original nave. A kind lady inside told me the nave was probably twice as long and wide as it is now, but you can see in the videos. So still a wonderful church, but again, what architectural beauty we've been deprived of. But Holy Trinity actually had a sister house, and only a few minutes walk from here you can find another out-of-place wall section. This is the last remnant of the only nunnery in medieval York, and the first female religious house in the whole of post-conquest Yorkshire. It was established around 1130 by Archbishop Thurston of York, hence Thurston Street. Little is known of the actual site, and unfortunately, in our sketch, only a fragment is actually visible. The nunnery was suppressed in 1536. But there was one more Benedictine house in York. It's the juggernaut of this video, once the wealthiest monastery in the north of England and the first monastic establishment in the entirety of post-conquest Yorkshire. These are the remains of St Mary's Abbey, another Benedictine monastery just like Holy Trinity. It sits opposite the minster that it once rivalled in size and strength. Just think about that for a second. The first thing you see surrounding the abbey is the walls, dating to 1260s, and they remain the most complete set of abbey walls in the whole country. The abbey precinct was huge and covered all of what is now Museum Gardens, as you can see on the screen. The remaining ruins of the abbey give a sense of its power and scale. It was actually begun on William the Conqueror's orders, and you can still see the locations of the original Norman parts of the abbey today. So it was symbolically a very Norman monastery in the centre of York, where William once faced the most resistance. It was then rebuilt in 1294 as the all-powerful famous monastery, of which the centre would have somewhat resembled the Great York Minster. For the entire duration of its existence, it seems locals were not too fond of the abbey due to its vast amounts of wealth. In fact, the abbot was one of the wealthiest, most powerful clergymen in the whole country, having a seat in the House of Lords and being featured as a villain in Robin Hood. So the city was not too sad to see the abbot and its 50 monks disappear in 1539. But what else remains of the abbey? On Marygate, named after the monastery, we can find the main entrance to the abbey precinct, purposely facing away from the centre of the city, to show that they were quite different and separate from York. From here you can see the hospitium, where guests would stay who weren't allowed in the abbey with the monks. A Watergate arch dating to around 1500 is attached. But where we can see the most powerful visual of this video is in the buildings known as King's Manor. This was originally the abbot's residence, but after the dissolution, Henry turned it into a palace for himself and as the headquarters of his Council of the North. This is very powerful symbolism, as to build lots of the post-dissolution King's Manor, they actually used the rubble from St Mary's Abbey. But next to the largest monastery in the north, we can find the remains of the once largest hospital in the north, that also found itself in ruin because of Henry. St Leonard's Hospital was closed in December 1540, making it the final survivor of all York's great religious houses. The gatehouse still remains in Museum Gardens, and we can see the exact same point on the sketch, with the building extending down to the minster at its peak. You can also see the partial remains of another hospital gate from this hospital, currently on the side of the Red House. This one's got some great history. So the first hospital was built on the site by King Aethelstan in the year 935. But the remains that you see now, the undercroft and the chapel of the infirmary, date to around 1240, after the hospital had been refounded by King Stephen, the grandson of William the Conqueror, who had his own rampage on the north as well. The hospital was very much linked to religion, as you can see by the remains. It would be easy to mistake this for an old decayed church. Prayer was part of the daily routine here, and the sick would not be treated until they confessed to their sins. The hospital contained 13 full-time Augustin canons and 8 nuns, so it felt the full force of Henry's dissolution. But this was not a one-off. 16 hospitals were destroyed in York, leaving the poor on the streets, and no hospital was built in the city for another 201 years. Furthermore, the city's hygiene standards plummeted as Henry had also dismantled all the public lavatories here due to their connections to the church institutions, meaning much of the city's poor would just do their business on the streets and in the bar walls. But what if I told you, next to the hospital and the abbey, there was another great, famous religious house, and it sits beneath the current street of Lendal on the riverbank. This again was a friary, home to members of the Augustinian order. This time we can find another old wall part, hidden deep within a pub named Lendal Cellars. This is part of the friary wall. Some of the friary stones were also used in the building of the wonderful mansion house too, just next door. But there's a couple of neat facts about this one. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, would actually stay in this building every time he visited York. Secondly, the friary contained one of only 3 libraries in the whole of England that were said to be adequate in science, with a huge quantity of Greek and Roman authors. It was the only library in the north to have Greek texts in the Middle Ages, and also at least 120 of the writings of Augustine being held here. The library with the friary was surrendered and dismantled in 1538. So you can see the impact goes far, far deeper than just losing hundreds of wonderful pieces of architecture. There are more monasteries, friaries, hospitals that I haven't included in this video, as there are no visible remains whatsoever. And it's hard to imagine how mentally tough it would have been for the monks and nuns to be ripped away from the only life that they ever knew. The public reaction to Henry VIII's rampage culminated in the famous rebellion, the Pilgrimage of Grace, in which York played a key role. Going in a full loop back to the start of the video, adjacent to the Franciscan Friary is Clifford's Tower on the old York Castle site, and it was here that the leader of the rebellion, Robert Aske, was put to his death. 4 years later, Henry VIII was to stroll into the city for the first time in his life, after he had effectively weakened the city beyond comprehension. He came with an entourage of over 9,000, including nobles and soldiers. He was met here at Fulford Cross, which once marked the city's boundary. He was met by York's most prominent figures, including the mayor and the recorder, who all fell to their knees and professed their regret for their role in the Pilgrimage of Grace and their repentance, promising to only serve the crown going forward. The king and his 5th wife now, Catherine Howard, were gifted large sums of gold as an apology, as the local citizens had been specially taxed for this gift during a major economic crash in the city as a result of the loss of the monasteries. Few places in the whole country were hit as hard as York by Henry VIII, and it serves as a reminder of what beauty we lost. Please do drop me a like on this one if you did enjoy it.